Thank you so much, Chris. My name is Carey Shenkman. I'm a human rights attorney, as Elena introduced. And I just want to give a little disclaimer. So I'm speaking today in my personal capacity. I did previously work on the legal team in the Assange case. I was also a expert witness in the London proceedings, but my comments today are in my personal capacity as a scholar of the Espionage Act. So I want to very briefly try to cram 100 years of history into 10 minutes. My co-author and I teamed up with a media historian. For years, we traced the 100-year political history of the Espionage Act, publishing a book titled A Century of Repression, the Espionage Act and Freedom of the Press. And there's one thing I want to emphasize about this book, and I think it's kind of summed up by our cover. Our cover has faces on it, and that was a very deliberate choice because ultimately these cases are about people and they ruin people's lives, even if these cases lead to no prosecution ultimately. But legal process is expensive, and these cases do have an impact. And in fact, when we're looking at the history of these people, as Chris already referenced, this law was passed and utilized during World War I to decimate anti-war opposition and labor movements. Here's a picture of Woodrow Wilson requesting Congress for a declaration of war. He threatened disloyalty with, quote, a firm hand of stern repression. Of course, it was used to imprison presidential candidate Eugene Debs in response to his famous anti-war speech. Bill Haywood, the leader of the Wobblies, there was a mass trial against the Wobblies, imprisoning them in mass in part for their anti-war resistance. Of course, the magazine, The Masses. And this led to one of the most vibrant oppositions to war in US history. Another somewhat unknown thread about the early Espionage Act is that it was really instrumental to the rise of the careers of J. Edgar Hoover and Roger Baldwin. Of course, J. Edgar Hoover went on to be the head of the FBI, and Roger Baldwin, he was at first the head of the Civil Liberties Bureau of the American Union Against Militarism, but then went on to found the ACLU. The Espionage Act was also implicated in prosecutions and investigations of the Black press, ranging from World War I to World War II. Here's a photo of John Senstack, the young editor of the Chicago Defender. And in fact, J. Edgar Hoover was nearly on a weekly basis sending copies of Black publications to the Justice Department asking for prosecution under the Act. In fact, this was because the Black press was a leading voice for civil liberties and anti-war resistance throughout that interwar period. There was also efforts to investigate the Chicago Tribune during World War II, and the act was arguably what sparked McCarthyism. The initial case and investigation that led to the Red Scare was of State Department diplomats and involved an alleged Espionage Act conspiracy and break-in to a journal, the Amerasia Journal's offices in New York City. Here's John Service, who was considered one of the most brilliant diplomats in US history with respect to US-China policy, and his career was effectively ruined by Senator McCarthy on the right. Very famous is the case of the New York Times and Daniel Ellsberg, related to the Pentagon Papers case that went to the Supreme Court. And there are also investigations of the New York Times and other lesser known publications like Beacon Press, with an interesting side thread of Senator Mike Gravel, who also led to full publication of the Pentagon Papers and was personally investigated and got calls by Richard Nixon. Here's one of our panelists with her client, Thomas Drake, who blew the whistle on abuse and waste in the NSA and was cited by Edward Snowden as one of the inspirations for his whistleblowing. And of course, we have Barry Pollack with his client, Jeff Sterling, who served time, again, under the Espionage Act, and numerous whistleblowers that are well known today. So what do these cases have in common? What they have in common is that from the beginning, the Espionage Act was about punishing, quote, interference with the foreign relations of the United States. It's lived in the shadows of virtually every military conflict and foreign policy controversy in the past century. And where does that lead us in 2024? Julian Assange is charged with 17 counts of violating this law for his role in publishing extensive human rights violations and war crimes in Iraq, Afghanistan, and around the world. Of course, when we hear this law called the Espionage Act, a lot of folks ask first, well, where's the espionage? But in fact, this law punishes way more than the common definition of espionage. It punishes whoever having unauthorized possession of any document relating to the national defense, who willfully communicates that to a person not entitled to receive it. This is a key law that's used to prosecute whistleblowers who are not accused of working for a foreign government. That language that I just showed you is not limited to spies in the common definition. It applies to government employees, the public, and even non-US citizens. In fact, it broadly punishes conduct related to national defense information. But a lot of folks will ask, well, national defense information, that sounds like pretty important stuff, right? But it does not mean military secrets, codes, or closely guarded information. It does not even need to be classified. It can include evidence of torture, war crimes, corruption, or government criminality. It's a contentious and controversial law. In fact, there are serious scholars that call this constitutionally problematic, labyrinthine, and assert that public speech in this country since World War II has been rife with criminality. Even former Attorney General Eric Holder has called for its revision and amendment. So a few key principles I want to emphasize. One, what's the impact of this law if this happened elsewhere? Let's put on our just imagine hats here and think about what would happen if this exact same fact pattern happened in Russia or in China. In fact, we saw there's a Wall Street journalist, Evan Gershkovich, who was investigated in Russia for his reporting there. And this was widely condemned in the US press, widely condemned in a way that we did not see in cases like the Assange case. And I don't even want to imagine if China, for instance, sought the extradition of a US journalist. It would be very clear the political motivation of those cases. The second question I want to ask, is Assange a whistleblower? No, he's not a whistleblower. He never signed an oath of loyalty to the US government. He's an Australian citizen. Australia is not in the US. Whistleblowers are commonly referred as folks who are inside government, who signed an oath of allegiance, who made that commitment. Assange doesn't have that obligation. He's not a US citizen. And this case would grant extraterritorial jurisdiction. Legally, he is not in the same position as someone like Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning, because this case would effectively set a precedent that this law applies to anyone on Earth. As a legal matter, Julian Assange is in the same position as anyone on Earth in any country, and that's a different legal position than a government insider. The third question that this case raises is what counts as hacking? And a lot of folks will say, well, there's the Espionage Act things, but there's also the allegedly icky hacking stuff, as the indictment alleges. But in fact, the law, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act that's predicated on, is contentious as well. It was passed in the 1980s, literally in response to a Matthew Broderick movie. Reagan saw the movie War Games, and it led to policy change during his administration. So I'll wrap up just briefly saying that it's effectively impossible for folks to get a fair trial under this law. The law is stacked against defendants. There's no opportunity to argue a public interest defense, and it's selectively enforced. Government officials do provide information to the press every day, but to no consequence. Only the critics, and of course, the folks that I presented to you earlier on, the ones who are presenting truth to power, the ones that are anti-war, are the ones prosecuted. So I'll go ahead and stop there and appreciate this panel and your contributions to this important conversation.
We have to celebrate those